The world held its breath when Prince Charles and Lady Diana announced their engagement in 1981, believing they were witnessing the beginning of a modern royal fairy tale. Cameras flashed, crowds roared, and a fresh-faced Diana, barely 19, smiled through it all, seemingly stepping into a life of regal splendor. But behind the dazzling spectacle, trouble was already brewing. This wasn't just a marriage, it was an arrangement shaped by tradition, duty, and unspoken expectations. And from the very start, one painful truth lingered beneath the surface. Diana loved Charles, but Charles's heart was elsewhere. The first glimpse of their fractured foundation came during their official engagement interview, a moment meant to cement their fairy tale image. When asked if they were in love, Diana beamed and answered confidently, "Of course." But then came Charles's response, four words that would haunt Diana for years: "Whatever in love means." The air in the room shifted. The words, cold and indifferent, landed with a thud, an ominous sign of what was to come. Diana later admitted she was stunned, unable to understand why the man she was about to marry would answer so dismissively. It wasn't just an awkward moment, it was a quiet warning, a foreshadowing of the emotional distance that would define their marriage. Beyond that unsettling exchange, the cracks deepened. Despite knowing each other for years before their engagement, Diana and Charles had spent very little time together. By many accounts, they had met only a handful of times before their relationship was sealed with a proposal. Diana, young and hopelessly romantic, was thrown into a world she barely understood, one ruled by rigid palace protocols, relentless media scrutiny, and, most painfully, a husband who never truly saw her. Perhaps the most devastating red flag of all was the presence of Camilla Parker-Bowles. Diana's instincts told her something was wrong, and she was right. Just before the wedding, she discovered a bracelet Charles had designed for Camilla, engraved with their secret pet names, G and F, for Gladys and Fred. It was a gut-wrenching confirmation of what she had feared all along. Charles's heart belonged to another. Devastated, Diana wanted to call off the wedding, but the pressure was immense. The royal machinery was already in motion, and with millions watching, there was no escape. On July 29, 1981, Diana walked down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral in what should have been the happiest moment of her life. Instead, beneath the glittering tiara and billowing gown, she carried the weight of doubt. The world saw a princess stepping into her fairy tale. Diana, however, was already beginning to realize it wasn't a love story, it was a tragedy waiting to unfold. In the world of royalty, perception isn't just important, it's everything. Every public appearance, every official portrait, every carefully worded statement is meticulously crafted to project an image of strength, unity, and tradition. But in the case of Charles and Diana, even something as seemingly insignificant as height was deliberately altered to fit a narrative. Years after their marriage, eagle-eyed observers began to notice a curious detail in their official portraits. No matter the setting, no matter the pose, Charles always appeared noticeably taller than Diana. It was a subtle manipulation, one most people wouldn't think twice about, except for one glaring fact. In reality, they were the exact same height. Standing at 5 feet 10 inches, Diana was neither unusually tall nor short, but when positioned next to Charles in official photos, she was often placed at a slight angle, made to tilt her head, or positioned lower to create the illusion that he towered over her. Even in paintings commissioned by the palace, the discrepancy remained. This was not an accident, it was by design. In the world of monarchy, symbolism is everything, and a taller Charles reinforced the image of a strong, dominant future king. It aligned with the unspoken expectation that the husband, the leader, must appear larger than life. A simple trick of photography ensured that this perception was maintained, no matter what reality said. But this wasn't just about optics, it was about power. Charles had always been a man burdened by expectations, constantly compared to those around him. And in Diana, he had a wife whose very presence seemed to diminish him. She was captivating in a way that he was not. Her natural charm and ability to connect with people made her an instant star, while Charles, despite his royal bloodline, often faded into the background. The palace may not have been able to control the love the public showered upon Diana, but they could control how she was presented beside her husband. If Charles could not outshine her in charisma, he would at least appear to overshadow her in stature. The need to uphold this illusion went beyond just photographs. Diana was often advised, if not outright instructed, to wear flat shoes in public to avoid appearing taller than Charles. Whether conscious or not, the message was clear: she was never meant to stand above him, not physically, and certainly not in influence. The irony, of course, was that no amount of careful staging could change reality. No matter how the palace framed their marriage, no matter how many inches Charles gained through camera tricks, the world still saw Diana for what she was, a woman who stood head and shoulders above the monarchy in ways they never anticipated. A royal wedding is designed to be flawless, a spectacle of grandeur and tradition that leaves no room for error. On July 29, 1981, millions watched as Prince Charles and Lady Diana's highly anticipated ceremony unfolded at St. Paul's Cathedral. Every detail had been meticulously planned: the shimmering silk gown, the cascading 25-foot train, the echo of sacred vows beneath the grand dome. It was meant to be a picture-perfect moment, one that would cement their union in history. Yet, in the midst of all the regal splendor, an unexpected misstep quietly disrupted the illusion. A single moment, small yet profound, hinted at the deeper truth about their relationship. Charles forgot to kiss his bride. In most weddings, the kiss is the final, triumphant seal of love, the moment that signifies unity and devotion. For a royal wedding, it was more than tradition, it was an expectation. Yet, when Charles and Diana exchanged their vows, there was no embrace, no tender gesture to mark the beginning of their life together. Instead, they turned and walked down the aisle, a married couple by law but already missing the warmth that should have defined their bond. It was an omission that, though subtle, left an unmistakable void. To some, it was simply an oversight. To others, it was something far more telling, an early glimpse into a marriage that, beneath its glittering surface, lacked the emotional connection it so desperately needed. The absence of the kiss did not go unnoticed. In a ceremony that had been choreographed to perfection, the missing moment hung in the air like an unfinished sentence. Diana, who had already harbored doubts about Charles's affections, may have felt this absence more keenly than anyone. It was as if the script had gone off course, revealing a truth that could no longer be concealed, that this was not a love story, but an arrangement bound by duty and expectation. Realizing the need to correct the mistake, the couple found their moment of redemption later that day. As they stepped onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace, greeted by a roaring crowd of well-wishers, Charles leaned in and kissed Diana before thousands of onlookers. It was spontaneous, unscripted, and in that instant, the moment was reclaimed. That single kiss, born out of necessity rather than passion, became an iconic royal tradition. Decades later, it would be repeated by Prince William and Kate Middleton, by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, a moment carefully preserved in the royal playbook. But unlike the generations that followed, Charles and Diana's kiss was never a reflection of genuine love. It was a performance, a way to correct a misstep in an event that, from the very start, had been more about optics than emotion. From the outside, Charles and Diana's marriage appeared to be the epitome of royal perfection. Two beautiful children, lavish public appearances, and the weight of the monarchy resting on their shoulders. Everything about their lives seemed to fit the fairy tale narrative. But behind the palace doors, their relationship was unraveling. The passion, the connection, and even the physical closeness that had once existed between them had all but disappeared. Diana would later reveal that their intimate relationship had completely faded about 7 years into their marriage, leaving behind a hollow partnership defined more by duty than by love. In a recorded conversation with her speech tutor, Peter Settlin, Diana spoke candidly about how the physical side of their marriage had simply fizzled out. She couldn't pinpoint exactly why or when it started to change, only that she instinctively knew when Charles had withdrawn from her. What had once been moments of closeness between husband and wife became increasingly rare, and before long, they stopped altogether. By the time their marriage reached its 12th year, Diana admitted that there was virtually nothing left between them. The emotional and physical distance between Charles and Diana was exacerbated by the presence of a third person, Camilla Parker-Bowles. Diana had always known, deep down, that Charles's heart belonged elsewhere, and as his connection to Camilla became more open, his relationship with Diana suffered even further. She was left feeling rejected, unworthy, and increasingly alone within the confines of the royal family. In her struggle to cope, she developed deep insecurities, questioning why the man she had married no longer desired her. Without intimacy, their marriage became nothing more than an obligation. Publicly, they maintained their royal duties, smiling for cameras, attending events side by side, but privately, they were living separate lives. For Diana, the lack of affection was devastating. She craved love, attention, and emotional validation, things Charles had no interest in providing. Over time, this loneliness would push her to seek love and companionship elsewhere, just as Charles had done. Their marriage, once full of promise, had become nothing more than an illusion, and the distance between them had never been wider. Long before Diana walked down the aisle, she knew she wasn't the only woman in Charles's heart. Just days before the wedding, in a moment that would forever shatter her illusions, she overheard a conversation that confirmed her worst fears. Charles was speaking to Camilla Parker-Bowles, his former girlfriend and, as Diana painfully realized, his true love. He told Camilla that no matter what happened, he would always love her. Diana, just 20 years old and on the brink of becoming the Princess of Wales, was devastated. But with the weight of the monarchy pressing down on her, the wedding was unstoppable. The world was watching. There was no turning back. Even after their vows were exchanged, Charles never truly let go of Camilla. While Diana was trying to adjust to her new life as a royal, Charles remained emotionally tethered to the woman he had loved for years. At first, Diana tried to ignore it, convincing herself that perhaps she was imagining things, that the bond between Charles and Camilla was a thing of the past. But the signs were everywhere. A bracelet Charles had specially designed for Camilla, inscribed with their pet names for each other, was given to her before the wedding. Diana found it and confronted Charles, but his reaction was indifferent. It was as if her feelings didn't matter. The betrayal only deepened in the years that followed. Charles and Camilla maintained regular contact, and before long, their affair was no longer just whispered about, it was happening in plain sight. Diana later described how she felt like a constant outsider in her own marriage, trapped in a love triangle where she was always the one left out. When asked about her husband's relationship with Camilla, she famously summed it up in one heartbreaking sentence: "Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." The affair tore at Diana's self-esteem, filling her with anger, jealousy, and an overwhelming sense of unworthiness. She tried to compete for Charles's love, but it became increasingly clear that she never truly had it to begin with. Eventually, Diana stopped trying. If Charles could find solace elsewhere, so could she. And so, as their marriage crumbled, both sought comfort outside of it, Charles returning to Camilla, and Diana searching for the love and validation that had been denied to her from the start. Their fairy tale had officially become a tragedy, played out under the scrutiny of the entire world. For years, Diana fought to make her marriage work, desperately hoping that Charles would see her, love her, and choose her. But as his affair with Camilla became impossible to ignore, she was left feeling abandoned, unwanted, and utterly alone. The emotional void was unbearable. She had entered the royal family as a young woman filled with hope, but now, trapped in a loveless marriage, she longed for someone who would truly care for her. And then, she met him. At just 24 or 25 years old, Diana found herself drawn to someone who offered her the kind of warmth and protection she had never received from her husband, a royal bodyguard named Barry Manicky. He wasn't just a security figure, he became her closest confidant, a man she described as the greatest friend I've ever had. Though she insisted their relationship was never physical, it was clear that he filled an emotional role Charles had long neglected. He was kind, attentive, and made her feel safe in a world where she felt constantly scrutinized and unloved. But just as she began to realize how deeply she cared for him, he was abruptly removed from his position and reassigned. Not long after, he was killed in a mysterious motorcycle accident. Diana later suggested that his death was no accident at all, hinting that forces within the royal establishment had intervened to put an end to their bond. The loss was devastating, but it also made one thing painfully clear: she would never find love within the walls of the palace. If Charles was free to pursue Camilla, then Diana, too, would eventually seek love elsewhere. As their marriage continued to unravel, she became involved in other relationships, some fleeting, some passionate, all driven by a desperate need for affection. She was linked to cavalry officer James Hewitt, a man who provided her with the validation and attention she craved. Their affair lasted several years, and Diana later admitted to it openly, though the relationship ended in heartbreak when Hewitt betrayed her trust by selling details of their love to the press. Diana's later romances, including her widely publicized relationship with Dodi Fayed, were often interpreted as acts of defiance, a way to reclaim the agency that had been stolen from her in a marriage she never truly had a choice in. But underneath it all, she was simply a woman searching for something that had eluded her for years: unconditional love. In her final years, she found comfort in those who cherished her for who she was, not for the title she held. If Charles had long since given his heart to another, Diana was determined not to spend the rest of her life waiting for something that would never come. Diana had always believed in the power of love, but as her marriage crumbled under the weight of betrayal and neglect, she found herself desperate for guidance. There was one person in the royal family who, in theory, had the authority to intervene: Queen Elizabeth II. As the head of the monarchy, and as Charles's mother, surely she could offer some wisdom, some direction, some kind of solution. And so, in a moment of anguish, Diana turned to the Queen, hoping for support. What she received instead was a response that only deepened her sense of isolation. Tears streaming down her face, Diana confronted the Queen, pouring out her pain, laying bare the reality of her marriage. She was not just dealing with a distant husband, she was fighting against a force she could not compete with. "What do I do?" she asked, pleading for guidance. "I'm coming to you, what do I do?" The Queen, known for her stoic nature and unwavering commitment to royal duty, gave a response that was as blunt as it was devastating: "I don't know what you should do. Charles is hopeless." For Diana, those words confirmed what she had feared all along: no one was going to save her. If the Queen herself saw no way to fix things, then what hope did she have? The response wasn't just disappointing, it was a surrender. The Queen, who had spent her entire life upholding the stability of the monarchy, was not going to intervene in a marriage that was already doomed. Charles was who he was, and there would be no changing him. Diana was left to navigate the wreckage of her life on her own. This brief but crushing exchange highlighted the stark contrast between Diana and the royal family. She had entered the marriage believing in love, in partnership, in emotional connection. The monarchy, however, operated on duty, tradition, and survival. Feelings were secondary. Struggles were to be endured in silence. If Charles had abandoned her emotionally, the royal institution had now done the same. Diana's pain did not disappear after that conversation, it only deepened. Her battle with bulimia worsened, her sense of worth continued to erode, and the loneliness she felt within palace walls became unbearable. The Queen's words weren't meant to be cruel, but they reinforced a harsh truth. In the eyes of the royal family, Diana was on her own. As Charles and Diana's marriage unraveled, their relationship deteriorated into something far worse than mere indifference. It became a battlefield of mistrust and paranoia. By the time their divorce was looming, Charles wasn't just emotionally distant from Diana, he had grown suspicious of her every move. He believed she wasn't just seeking love elsewhere, he feared she was scheming against him. And in his mind, she wasn't acting alone. One of the most shocking revelations about Charles's growing paranoia was his belief that Diana was working with Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, to undermine him. Sarah, known for her close friendship with Diana, was married to Charles's younger brother, Prince Andrew. Charles began to suspect that the two women had concocted a plan, one that would ultimately push him out of the line of succession. According to royal biographer Tom Bower, Charles feared that if Queen Elizabeth were to die or abdicate, Diana and Sarah would maneuver Prince Andrew into a position of power, making him regent until Prince William came of age. In this scenario, Charles would be completely bypassed, cast aside in favor of his younger brother. It was a theory that, on the surface, seemed absurd. But in Charles's mind, it made sense. Diana had already gone public with her doubts about his suitability to be king. She had openly questioned whether he had the temperament and character to lead the nation. She was beloved by the public in a way that Charles never was, and her words carried weight. If she had enough influence to shift public perception, what else was she capable of? The mere fact that Charles believed such a conspiracy was possible spoke volumes about the depth of the distrust between him and Diana. Their marriage had disintegrated into something so toxic that Charles no longer viewed Diana as just an estranged wife, he saw her as a threat. And the irony was that, while Charles feared Diana was conspiring against him, she was simply trying to survive in a system that had failed her. Diana, for her part, was not the schemer Charles imagined her to be, but she was increasingly aware of the power she held. If she couldn't change her marriage, if she couldn't stop Charles from being with Camilla, then she could at least reclaim her own voice. And that was what truly unsettled Charles, not a grand conspiracy, but the realization that Diana no longer needed him, and that, despite being the future king, he was losing the battle for public sympathy. For years, Charles and Diana had lived separate lives, their marriage reduced to a mere formality. By 1992, the official announcement of their separation confirmed what the world already suspected: the fairy tale had ended. Yet, despite the emotional distance and public scandals, an actual divorce was not immediately on the table. The royal family preferred discretion, and for a time, it seemed both Charles and Diana would remain legally bound, even if only in name. But after years of increasingly publicized affairs, personal confessions, and growing tensions, the Queen herself was forced to step in and demand an end to the charade. In December 1995, Diana did something that left the monarchy reeling. She gave a now infamous interview to the BBC's Panorama. In it, she spoke with raw honesty about the pain of her marriage, her struggles with bulimia, and Charles's ongoing affair with Camilla. "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded," she said, delivering a line that would forever be etched in history. She also cast doubt on Charles's ability to be king, further shaking the already fragile public image of the monarchy. It was an unprecedented move. No royal had ever been so candid, so willing to expose the institution's failings. And the royal family, particularly the Queen, had had enough. Shortly after the interview aired, Queen Elizabeth sent letters to both Charles and Diana, essentially ordering them to finalize their divorce. What had once been a slow, reluctant separation was now a necessity. There was no going back. In August 1996, after nearly 4 years of limbo, the marriage was officially dissolved. The settlement granted Diana a lump sum of £17 million, a generous annual allowance, and the right to retain her residence at Kensington Palace. However, there was one condition: she was stripped of her title of Her Royal Highness. She would still be known as Diana, Princess of Wales, but losing the HRH meant she was no longer considered a formal member of the royal family. For Diana, this was a painful blow. It meant that from that moment on, she would be expected to curtsy to those who once saw her as an equal, even to her own children. Despite the loss of her royal status, Diana was finally free. No longer bound by royal protocol, she threw herself into humanitarian work, traveling the world and using her voice for causes she deeply cared about: landmine victims, AIDS patients, and the marginalized. She was reinventing herself, stepping into a life of purpose beyond the palace walls. But her new chapter was tragically short-lived. Just 1 year after the divorce, on August 31, 1997, Diana was killed in a car crash in Paris. The world mourned, and in the aftermath, the royal family faced an unprecedented crisis. The public's grief quickly turned into outrage, with many blaming the monarchy for the way Diana had been treated. In life, she had been the people's princess, beloved by millions. In death, she became a symbol of a monarchy that had failed to protect one of its own. Her divorce had granted her freedom, but in many ways, it also cemented her fate. Diana had fought to carve out a life beyond the constraints of royalty, but in the end, she remained just as much a prisoner of fame and expectation as she had been inside the palace. The love story that was once promised had never materialized, and though she had finally escaped the confines of her unhappy marriage, the price she paid was one that shook the world forever.